So a few months ago, I was getting to know a brand new voice student. She's a 9-year-old girl, and I was asking her the typical questions that I ask new students, like what's your favorite color, what's your favorite animal, what kind of music do you like? She told me that her favorite color is purple, and her favorite animal is dogs, which I approved of, so it was fine. We knew that we'd have a decent teacher-student relationship. And then she surprised me by saying that, not talking about her favorite artist or her favorite style of music, but by telling me that she's really interested in music history. She told me that after probing a little bit further, that she has heard of both Beethoven and Michael Jackson. So music history to her is Moonlight Sonata and Thriller, and I thought that that was kind of charming, but I wasn't exactly sure why these particular artists were the two that she thought of immediately. So after I gave her kind of a brief overview of the history of Western music, I was telling her about the medieval era and the Baroque and everything, I started to think about how we got to this point and why these are the two that she thought of. Now, we typically define music by genre. We are human, and we like to categorize. So there's classical, there's jazz, there's contemporary, like pop and rock. And then there's world music, which is probably the most vague and problematic genre of them all. Now, while music genres tend to give us some insight into the kind of sounds that we're going to hear, these categorizations often create divisions. Now, I'm a musician, so is my friend here, Andre. We both study jazz here at the Frost School of Music, but our influences go a lot deeper than that. I grew up singing Sarah Bareilles and playing Chopin nocturnes. And Andre grew up with Bill Evans and Billy Joel. Now, Andre and I both have many different influences, but well, now we both play in a lot of different styles. I sing with a folk trio, I play piano for musicals, and I also play my own music with Andre sometimes, which is kind of searching for its own genre. Now, we're not necessarily unique in this way. We both have many different influences, but many musicians grow up listening to a variety of styles and play more than one. Now, typically, when I play a jazz standard like Bewitched or I Could Write a Book for an older audience, they tend to say, well, they tend to get really excited about this, right? And they're biased towards the music that they're playing. Now, Bewitched and I Could Write a Book are both jazz standards from the Great American Songbook, and the older generation is biased towards this music. And we're biased, too, towards the music of our own day. Musical nostalgia, to quote Mark Joseph Stern, isn't just a cultural phenomenon, it's a neuronic command. Now, typically, the music that we listen to during our formative years is deeply rooted in the culture that surrounds us, reflecting our personal identities, our social lives, and our neighborhoods and the outside world's influence. But as it's a neuronic command, essentially when we listen to music that we like, our brains release the neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, that make us feel great. It's the same stuff that makes us feel good when we have sex or when we eat a really good piece of cake. And when we're teenagers, our brains are on hyperspeed, making rapid-fire neural connections, while growth hormones run rampant in our bodies, all during the most formative years of our personal identities and social lives. So this all makes the connection between music, emotion, and memory really amplified. Now, as we grow older, to quote Dr. Adrienne North, we do listen to new music, but with a bias towards that which sounds similar to that which we listen to ages 16 to 24. And second, the actual pieces that we listen to tend to become more complex as we grow older. So imagine a girl from Pennsylvania who grew up on dad rock before transitioning to pop punk around junior high. Now, she may grow older to listen to a slightly more sophisticated blend of music, but no matter how many new artists she introduces to her library, none will sound as sweet as the Fall Out Boy that she listened to when she was 14. Yeah, pop punk is forever. The definition of music is pretty vague. We can infer that music is basically sound that has harmonic, rhythmic, and melodic continuity, but we know that this isn't necessarily always true. Who here has heard of John Cage's 433? Anyone? Yeah, we've got a couple tentative hands. So I gave this presentation in my choir the other day, and everyone was like really excited about that. So I'm glad to share this with you guys. So for those of you wondering, Andre is actually playing it right now. Yeah, it's really beautiful, right? So 433 is literally 4 minutes and 33 seconds of the pianist not playing a single note. It's just 4 minutes and 33 seconds of listening to the room around us. Now, this is a bit more extreme of an example, yes, and it's making a statement. John Cage was famous for that. But the idea is that we can find music in anything. We can find music in birds chirping in a forest or a street performance of percussive trash cans. Now, John Cage himself said that everything we do is music. This is all very nice, but it doesn't really give us an exact idea of what music actually can be defined as. So if we take a closer look at definitions of 3 major Western music genres, we see that the definitions have an idea of the harmonic language, maybe, or harmonic language or instruments that are typical in certain types of music, but these ideas don't necessarily give us the best idea of how to define the genres. The one thing that's consistent in all 3 of the music genres is the mention of a time or location of origin. So music, like language, is acquired through cultural transmission. So just as we incorporate the slang that we hear all around us into our daily vocabulary, we take musical cues from our environment as well. I listened to pop punk because my middle school friends listened to pop punk. And I study jazz now because I got to college and started to jam with my friends who play jazz. But perhaps more important than the actual sound of the music is the tradition and culture involved. Let's think about not the sound, but the ritual involved. So often, it's the audience participation that helps to define a genre. Sometimes it's a bit more obvious, as in the different ways that we dress or prepare for a show at an opera house or a jazz club or an underground basement show. And sometimes it's a bit more subtle, as in the different Latin American claves and dances involved in samba, bachata, and salsa. Now, I was asking my friend Srihari to get an idea of what the cultural sounds of his native country, India, are, because every culture, of course, has their own unique traditions. And he told me that genres are only proof of cultural difference. Now, in India, it's an incredibly diverse country, and all the different regions have their unique sounds. In the north, for example, there's Sufi, there's Indian trance, Indian ballads, and Punjabi music, as well as the Western music that has infiltrated. And then I asked another friend of mine from Tokyo who, for a similar answer, and he told me that the Japanese musical tradition is based on the more quiet and observant nature of the Japanese people. Well, often, because of the isolation of their island, the Japanese tend to be really fantastic copiers, and they're really great at incorporating the sounds from other places and fusing them with their own. Now, this can be found in their electronic, hip-hop, and jazz fusion music. I haven't yet gotten to travel to India or Japan, but I have gotten to travel a bit on my own, and I've met some really interesting people through those travels. Now, in January, I was talking to a man from Germany on a plane. We happened to sit next to each other, and we were talking about different languages and cultures. And he said something that I found really interesting. He said that a language reflects the people who speak it. Now, his native language of German is a very direct language. It's not necessarily considered the most beautiful language by everyone, but it is very efficient, like its people. Now, the admiration for efficiency can be found in their architecture as well as their cars, right? Now, by contrast, he told me that he lived in Thailand for several years, for about 10 years. Now, Thai can be a bit of a challenge to learn, especially for Westerners. And this isn't just because their alphabet is completely different and we can't sound out the words like we would in most Latin or Germanic-based languages. This is actually because, according to him, Thai includes extra letters in words just because they look aesthetically pleasing. Now, Thai culture similarly treasures ornate beauty, which we can see in their architecture as well. Now let's take this example of a couple different languages. Now, if we took a Spanish and an Italian speaker and we put them in a room together and told them to go crazy, become best friends, they might have a bit of a challenge talking to each other, right? Because they speak totally different languages. But Spanish and Italian are both Romance languages. They're very similar grammatically, and they have many cognates, so many similarities in vocabulary. So while they wouldn't exactly be able to speak the other's language, they'd probably be able to get a gist of what the other is saying. The same could be said for music. So let's say the same scenario, but in this case, it's two guitarists, one who plays classical guitar and one who plays jazz. So a classical guitarist has a very specific technique. Often the guitar is held upright with the neck up here, and the strings are made of nylon rather than metal, like we would find in acoustic or electric guitars. And jazz guitarists tend to hold them down here. So there are slight differences, but more or less, they're playing the same notes on just about the same instrument. And while their playing is of a completely different style, they'd probably be able to appreciate the other's playing even if they couldn't reproduce it themselves. Now, all musicians don't necessarily play the same way, just as all humans don't necessarily speak the same way, but often the similarities outweigh the differences. Now, imagine if every human on Earth spoke the same language. In India alone, there are 122 major languages spoken, and there are about 1,600 others spoken as well. And worldwide, there are over 7,000 languages spoken. Now, I'm not trying to claim that every music genre or every language is the same. That's crazy. But just as a language is made up of conversations, which are made of sentences, made of words, made of letters, many agree that music is a language in its own right, made up of songs, which are made of phrases, made of notes. Often, two languages are grammatically similar or share an alphabet, and the similarities can be found in music genres as well. And while every language or music genre is going to have its unique expressions, often the similarities outweigh the differences. Now, earlier, I mentioned Bewitched and I Could Write a Book. These are two really commonly performed jazz tunes, but they weren't actually written for jazz musicians at all. They're from the same Rodgers and Hart musical that I hadn't heard of before, called Pal Joey. And the crossover like this can be found other places as well, like Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, which is basically a rock opera work, unless it's performed by Kanye West, in which case it's just something completely different. Jeremy Dank, a classical pianist, has called Bach's Goldberg Variations the biggest jazz riff of all time. And in the 1400s, Guillaume Dufay turned his secular, basically pop song, into a mass of the same name, Mi solo fa sai parla. And then there's Gershwin. Now, Gershwin is probably one of the best examples of the crossover between genres. Let's take his folk opera, Porgy and Bess. This produced some really commonly performed songs like Summertime, which has been performed by musicians of just about every genre. He composed I've Got Rhythm, which is one of the most influential in jazz history. But just like Bewitched and I Could Write a Book, wasn't actually written for jazz musicians. It's from a musical called Girl Crazy, which also featured the tunes Embraceable You and But Not For Me. He's also composed classical orchestral works like his Concerto in F, as well as a Cuban overture. And then there's his little-known piece, Rhapsody in Blue, which is basically a symphonic jazz work. Now, Gershwin had his feet in so many different genres that we might think he was like part octopus if we didn't have photographic evidence of his two legs. But his work is, while it is indefinable, it's beloved, and that's because it all sounds like Gershwin. Now, if you do a quick Google search of genre names, like weird genre names, you'll find works from Spotify and others, of neo-soul, electro swing, medieval rock, freak folk, but And that's awesome. So there's something for everyone, as there's so many different music genres. Now, I'm not trying to say that every music genre is the same, again, just like every human doesn't speak the same way. But just as humans can learn more than one language, musicians and music lovers can expand their listening palette. If we get too caught up in the labels, then we tend to miss out on some really fantastic music. Now, we tend to define ourselves as classical, jazz, or contemporary in the music world, but like Gershwin, we should be using these traditions to inspire and to affect what we're creating while striving to sound our most authentic. Now, let's get back to Beethoven and Michael Jackson. Moonlight Sonata and Thriller. One of them was composed by a pivotal romantic composer in 1801, and the other was written by the King of Pop and performed by the King of Pop in 1982. The one is a solo classical piano piece, and the other uses heavy modern production, but they both are in the same key. They're both in C# minor, so that's something, right? Now, Michael Jackson and Beethoven may not have spoken the same language verbally or musically, but their message is the same. Create what is genuine and don't get too caught up in labels. Now, if Beethoven and Michael Jackson could have this much in common, maybe we have more in common than we think. Thank you.